Hey everyone, this is Mike and today we're going to be talking about Red Mage in Shadowbringers. Now, whenever we talk about Red Mage, a lot of people like to say that the job is too easy, it's very boring. The only reason why you would bring it to raid is because it has a spammable res button, and all of those things kind of together make it so that Red Mage sometimes has a quite negative feel whenever people ask about it. And whenever I want to play it in raid, sometimes people are like, do you really enjoy playing Red Mage because it's so boring? Do you really not want to play something that is a little bit more exciting to play? And on the other hand, for me personally, Red Mage is probably my favorite caster at the moment. Yes, it is relatively simple to play, but because of the proc-based gameplay, the fact that you have to balance your mana gauge as you build it up, the fact that there is a melee combo attached to your rotation as well, makes it actually very interesting to play for me personally. And I also think that Red Mage is one of those jobs that has a very cool image, so to speak. Like, you're balancing up casting abilities to get those mana gauges raised. Once the mana gauge is high enough, you use your gap closer, you're getting close to the boss, you do that very flashy melee combo, you backflip out of the action, and then you finish it off with your two finishing moves, depending on how your mana gauge is looking at that point. Stylistically speaking, Red Mage is one of the coolest looking jobs in the game, and it's also very fun to play for me personally. I like proc-based jobs, it's one of the reasons why I like the ranged physicals so much, one of the reasons why I loved Machinist back in Stormblood, because it had procs back then. Of course, it doesn't have those anymore, but as I mentioned in a previous video, I still quite like to play Machinist right now. But I do really like the proc-based gameplay, and Red Mage offers that to me because it adds a little bit of RNG into the rotation. You're not always pressing the same buttons. Now, because there is also the other elements involved, like for example the melee combo, makes it very interesting because it is very unique as a caster. Neither of the other two casters need to get in close to the boss to deal their damage, whereas Red Mage does. The dual casting nature of Red Mage is also something that is pretty interesting because it makes it so that you feel very mobile, because every other GCD you are going to be able to take a few steps of movement, but when it comes down to continuous movement, that is something that Red Mage is actually kind of lacking compared to the other two. Because if you look at the other two casters, Black Mage for example can use their polyglot stacks, they can save them up for movement heavy parts of the fight. You can for example save a Fire Starter or a Thundercloud proc, you can save your Sharp Cast in order to guarantee one of those procs, and you can also use something like Ethereal Manipulation to jump to a party member, or you can even save something like your Triple Cast. As you can see, a lot of resources that you can save up for those movement heavy parts of the fight. When it comes down to Summoner, it's even more ridiculous. At this point, Summoner is almost like a ranged physical DPS, because whenever they're in a trance, they have no cast times, and then when they're outside of a trance, they still have their Ruin 4 stacks, which are gotten from their Eggy Assault, which all of those abilities are instant cast as well. So Summoner incredibly mobile. Now when it comes down to Red Mage, however, yes, they are very mobile through this dual casting nature, meaning that whenever you get a chance to cast a spell, you are going to have another 2 seconds or so of mobility available to you. But outside of that, Red Mage actually doesn't have any mobility resources that are specific to them. Yes, you still have a Swift cast, but outside of that, that's pretty much it. You have your dual cast and you have your Swift cast, and if you do not have the chance to cast an ability, you also can't proc the dual cast, meaning that you don't have that movement available to you. Now, of course, I do know that we have Reprise. Reprise is the one ability that we can use for movement whilst we don't have anything else ready for us, but it costs resources, it costs mana gauge, and we generally don't really want to spend the mana gauge on Reprise because we need that mana gauge to do our big burst combo, our melee attacks. Now, of course, sometimes you can use your Reprise here or there to kind of balance out your mana gauge when we're looking at some of our other abilities, but in general, using Reprise is most of the time going to be a damage loss, so we don't just want to be spamming it for movement. So a lot of people think Red Mage is super mobile, definitely is not as mobile as something like, for example, a Summoner when it comes down to continuous mobility. When it comes down to just having to move here or there every now and then, as long as you get the option to cast for one GCD, yes, you feel very mobile, but when it comes down to having to move for a little while on end, because a mechanic dictates for it, like for example in Shiva Savage, the Worm's Lament 2, no wait, Isolate Dragon Song is the mechanic that it is called, that is usually a little bit stricter on a Red Mage than it might be on a Summoner or a Black Mage, because they don't really have the time to cast an extra ability over there. So that's just kind of the little movement out of the way, because I did really want to address this one, as that is something that is usually kind of looked at wrongly from a lot of people that don't necessarily play Red Mage all that much. Now, why would you want to bring a Red Mage to a raid? Because usually Red Mage is immediately compared to something like a Summoner, because both of them bring a raid buff and both of them also have a resurrection available to them. Now, as it stands right now, with the most recent patch nerfing Summoner a tiny bit again, and with the previous patch 5.2 buffing Red Mage as well, they're currently very close together when it comes down to the damage that they deal. Red Mage is slightly behind on Summoner still, but I do really think that it balances itself out when we look at the utility that Red Mage brings. Yes, both of them have a raid buff, both of them bring a resurrection to the table, but Red Mage has a much easier time spamming their res ability than something like a Summoner does, because of this dual casting nature. Summoner needs their swift cast, or they need to be casting for 8 seconds, whereas Red Mage doesn't need swift cast, and they also don't need to cast for 8 seconds. They just need to proc their dual cast off of something like a Jolt, or even a Cure, because Red Mage even has a healing ability that actually heals for quite a bit. So Red Mage can keep the tank alive while, for example, rezzing both of the healers or something like that, which you will also see in the gameplay in the background. If I wasn't playing Red Mage in this specific pull, we would most likely not have cleared it, or maybe we would have had to use a heal LB3 or something like that in order to get through that rough patch in the fight, which of course you'll see later down the line. So when it comes down to choosing in between, do you want a Red Mage, do you want a Summoner? For me, it's a very simple answer. Red Mage is a much safer job to bring to a party because you have that chain res ability. If you don't need the extra DPS, or when you're going through raid proc, for example, Red Mage is incredibly strong because they can just res people left and right, make sure that everybody is alive to see further into the fights. Then of course, when it comes down to meeting that enrage, if you really need that little bit of extra DPS, where you don't even have the chance to, of course, afford few deaths, because when you're fighting for your first enrage, going for that first clear, you usually can't really rely on Red Mage rezzing 3 or 4 people in the fight, because if you've had to res 4 people, you're most likely not going to meet the enrage anyways. So that is where Summoner might come in, and that little bit of extra DPS that Summoner provides could be what makes or breaks the run. Now, of course, I played Red Mage for this raid tiers prog, and we had no issues meeting the DPS check, so Red Mage is definitely in a very good spot at the moment. If you want to play it for raid progression, if you want to play it into Ultimate Rage, or if you just want to take it to Party Finder and kind of be the supportive caster over there as well, in case people mess up here or there, Red Mage is very strong in those regards. So now that we've talked about kind of the movement behind Red Mage, the idea behind it, the support that it brings, what does Red Mage do for itself? Well, when we look at the rotation of Red Mage, it is relatively straightforward. You have a couple of abilities that will generate mana gauge for you, both black and white mana, and then once your mana gauge is high enough, you can get in close, do a completely enhanced melee combo, which will then proc into your 2 finishing abilities. And then from there, you pretty much start at the beginning again. Build up that mana gauge, getting close for the melee combo, do your 2 finishers, and repeat. Very fun gameplay style in my opinion, because not only are you casting from afar, you also need to get in close to the boss every now and then to do that melee combo. And then in between all of that, you also still have a few of global cooldowns that you need to manage as well, together with the procs that are coming from your GCD abilities. So what do we have available to us? Well, if we don't have anything going for us at the moment, we have no dual cast procs, we don't have any procs on our GCDs either, we have Jolt. Jolt is our basic starter move that will get us going. It'll generate a little bit of black and white mana for us, and it will also, more importantly, get us that dual cast proc. Now, once we have our dual cast proc, we want to spend it on one of 2 abilities. We have Ver Arrow, which is going to go into our white mana gauge, or we have Ver Thunder, which is going into our black mana gauge. Now, the reason why we want to spend our dual cast proc on these 2 skills is because they both have a 5-second cast time, which of course is the double of what you would normally have, whereas Jolt and then the other 2 skills that are linked to Arrow and Thunder are only on a 2.2 second cast time with a 2.5 second recast timer, meaning that you want to be using those to proc that dual cast for you. So as I mentioned, with Ver Arrow, this one has a 50% chance to proc into Ver Stone, which is then going to replace your Jolt, and then Ver Thunder has a 50% chance to proc into Ver Fire, which again will then replace your Jolt to give yourself that dual cast proc. So that's kind of like how the GCD rotation is going to go. You're using your Jolt to get dual cast, use Arrow or Thunder depending on if you need black or white mana gauge, and then those have a chance to proc Stone or Fire, which will then replace Jolt in order to get you that dual cast proc in the rotation, and then basically you just keep going from there. It's kind of a balancing act to make sure that you don't create too big of an imbalance on your mana gauge, because if you create too big of an imbalance, then generating the lesser mana is going to be a little bit harder. Now, once you've built up your mana gauge high enough, you can get in close and do a fully enhanced melee combo. You need 80 on both of the mana gauges for this. So 1, 2, 3 combo, it's also a very fast one, so you can't double weave whilst you are using this combo. And then you just do your 1, 2, 3, and then you can use one of your two finishers, either for Holy or for Flare. You're going to be using the one depending on which of your two mana gauges is the lowest. And then after you've used Holy or Flare, you can also use the combo action Scorch, which will grant you a little bit of black and white mana gauge again as well, and then you pretty much start off all over again. Now, to help with the gap close and the backflip, we of course also have Kora Core. This is your gap closer, so if you're standing very far away from the boss and you need to get close to do that melee combo, you can use your Kora Core, and then when you're done using your melee combo, you can use your backflip displacement in order to just get away from the boss again. Or if you don't have a chance to use displacement, because it does take up 2 of global cooldown actions, because it's a very lengthy animation, kind of like how Dragoon has their jumps. If you don't have time to use displacement, or you don't have the of global cooldown spaces to use displacement, you can also use engagement, which is basically doing the same for you, but it just is going to be able to be double weaved. You also don't get the actual backflip, you can just do it on the spot, but it does do a little bit less damage. You have to kind of choose accordingly depending on whether or not it is possible to use displacement or not. And that is pretty much the GCD rotation of Red Mage. It's very simple, very straightforward. Outside of that, we of course have a couple of off-global cooldowns that just deal damage, like Flash and Contra Sixth. Just use these when they're on cooldown to do as much damage as possible. We also have Manification. This is not only going to grant you a small damage buff, but it will also double the mana gauge that you currently have at the moment. So once you've generated enough mana, you can just use your Manification to just immediately be able to get in close to the boss to deal that damage, because it will also reset your Kora Core and your displacement. So you're definitely gonna have that gap closer ready to get close immediately. We also have a raid buff called Embolden. This one is only going to be buffing yourself with magic damage and the rest of your team with physical damage. So because of this, Red Mage doesn't necessarily play all that nicely together with other casters, because they're only going to be buffing the physical damage of the raid. So it's only going to be buffing your tanks, your melee DPS, and your ranged physical DPS. Because of that, Red Mage is best played in a solo caster environment. Of course, double caster still works fine, especially right now. But if we're talking about like purely optimal scenarios, it's best to be played in a solo caster environment. Outside of that, we still have Acceleration, which will guarantee you procs as well. As I said before, Arrow and Thunder have a 50% chance to grant you that Fire and Stone proc, but when you have Acceleration active, the next 3 arrows and thunders that you're going to be using are going to be giving you that guaranteed proc. And this also counts for your finisher moves, Holy and Flare, by the way, but you usually won't be using it on them, as you can guarantee 100% proc from those by just having that slight imbalance in your mana when you use them as your combo finisher from your melee combo. And that is pretty much Red Mage. In my opinion, a very fun job to play, also a very cool team job to bring to the party, because it does pretty decent personal damage, it has a raid buff in that of Embolden, and then you also have this insane support of being able to resurrect half of the party and just continue on to see more mechanics during proc, or to maybe save the party when you are going for a re-clear for your weeklies or something like that. That's gonna be for me. I want to thank you for watching, I want to thank my patrons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.